I never thought my life would be sold for $30,000. But there I was, 19 years old, sitting in our cramped apartment while my father spoke in hushed tones with a man whose expensive suit looked completely out of place among our second-hand furniture. The walls seemed to close in as I heard words that would shatter my world forever. My mother's medical bills had been piling up for months. Stage 4 cancer doesn't care about your bank account, and chemotherapy costs more than most people make in a year. I had watched my father age 10 years in the past 6 months, his shoulders carrying the weight of impossible decisions. But I never imagined the solution would involve me becoming merchandise. She's educated, speaks 3 languages, and has never caused any trouble, my father was saying, his voice cracking slightly. I wanted to scream that I was sitting right there, that they were talking about me like I was livestock being appraised. The stranger nodded, pulling out an envelope thick with cash that represented more money than our family had ever seen at once. When they finally called me into the room, I felt like I was walking to my execution. The man introduced himself as Hassan, a representative of Sheikh Abdullah al-Rashid. He explained that the Sheikh was looking for a companion, someone young and intelligent, who could bring new perspectives to his life. The word wife was never mentioned, but it hung in the air like smoke. If you're watching this and thinking about sharing it with someone who needs to hear about life's unexpected turns, please do. Sometimes the stories that seem impossible are the ones that change us the most. My hands shook as I signed papers I barely understood. Legal documents in Arabic and English that sealed my fate with elegant calligraphy and official stamps. Hassan assured my father that I would be well cared for, that the Sheikh was known for his kindness and wisdom. But all I could think about was how I had just traded my freedom for my mother's life. The flight to Dubai felt like being transported to another planet. I had never been on a plane before, never left my small town in rural Morocco. Now I was soaring above clouds, heading toward a life I couldn't begin to imagine. The other passengers looked so sophisticated, so worldly, while I clutched my small suitcase containing everything I owned. As the plane descended toward Dubai International Airport, I pressed my face against the window and gasped. The city sprawled before me like something from a science fiction movie, with towering skyscrapers that seemed to pierce the sky and artificial islands shaped like palm trees. This wasn't just a different country. This was a different universe entirely. Hassan met me at the airport with a driver and a black Mercedes that probably cost more than my family's apartment. As we drove through the city, I stared in amazement at the luxury surrounding me. Gold shops with displays that glittered like treasure chests, restaurants with crystal chandeliers visible from the street, and shopping malls that looked like palaces. But my wonder quickly turned to anxiety as we left the city behind and drove into the desert. The urban jungle gave way to endless dunes that shifted and changed with the wind. I had never seen so much emptiness, so much space that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The Sheikh's estate appeared like a mirage on the horizon. It wasn't the typical palace I had imagined from fairy tales, but rather a stunning modern compound that blended traditional Arabic architecture with contemporary design. Palm trees lined the entrance, and fountains created a symphony of water sounds that somehow made the desert feel less harsh. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears as Hassan led me through corridors decorated with intricate tile work and calligraphy that told stories I couldn't read. Servants bowed respectfully as we passed, their faces kind but curious about the young woman who had just arrived to change their master's life. I was shown to quarters that were larger than my entire family home. The bedroom alone could have housed 3 families comfortably, with a 4-poster bed draped in silk and windows that offered breathtaking views of the desert landscape. A sitting area was furnished with cushions and low tables in the traditional style, while a modern bathroom featured a marble bathtub that looked like it belonged in a luxury spa. But the opulence felt suffocating rather than comforting. I was a bird in a golden cage, and no amount of luxury could change the fact that I was here against my will. I unpacked my few belongings, which looked pathetically small in the enormous wardrobe that could have housed hundreds of outfits. A gentle knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. A woman entered, introducing herself as Amira, who would be my personal attendant. She was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. She spoke Arabic, French, and English fluently, making communication much easier than I had feared. "The Sheikh would like to meet you for dinner tonight," Amira explained, as she helped me choose appropriate clothing from a selection that had apparently been prepared for my arrival. He understands you may be nervous, but he wants you to know that he has no intentions of pressuring you into anything uncomfortable. I stared at myself in the full-length mirror, wearing a beautiful blue dress that probably cost more than my father made in a month. The girl looking back at me seemed like a stranger, someone playing dress-up in a life that didn't belong to her. My reflection showed fear mixed with curiosity, and I wondered if the Sheikh would see right through my attempt to appear composed. The dining room was an architectural masterpiece, with a domed ceiling painted with stars and geometric patterns that seemed to move in the candlelight. A long table was set for two, with crystal glasses and gold-rimmed plates that reflected the warm glow of traditional lanterns hanging from the ceiling. I expected to wait nervously for the Sheikh's arrival, but instead found myself genuinely amazed by the beauty surrounding me. Every detail had been carefully considered, from the fresh jasmine flowers that perfumed the air to the soft instrumental music that created an atmosphere of calm rather than intimidation. When Sheikh Abdullah finally entered the room, I had to catch my breath. This wasn't the elderly tyrant I had imagined based on stories and stereotypes. Yes, he was 75 years old, with silver hair and lines that spoke of decades of experience. But his eyes were intelligent and kind, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his power through intimidation. He was dressed simply in traditional white robes that somehow managed to look both elegant and humble. There was something almost grandfatherly about his presence, except for the sharp intelligence in his gaze that missed nothing. When he smiled and gestured for me to sit, I found myself relaxing slightly for the first time since arriving. "Please call me Abdullah," he said in perfect English, his voice warm and reassuring. "I know this situation must feel overwhelming, and I want you to understand that we have all the time in the world to get to know each other. There are no expectations tonight, except honest conversation." I had prepared myself for demands, for immediate pressure to fulfill whatever role he expected of me. Instead, he asked about my journey, whether I was comfortable in my quarters, and if there was anything I needed to feel more at home. His genuine concern caught me completely off guard. The meal was delicious, but I could barely taste it, too focused on studying this man who now controlled my destiny. He seemed more interested in learning about my education, my dreams that had been interrupted, and my thoughts about the dramatic change in my circumstances. For someone who had essentially purchased a wife, he was remarkably interested in my opinions and feelings. As the evening progressed, I found myself actually engaging in conversation, rather than just answering questions out of obligation. Abdullah spoke about his travels around the world, his business interests that spanned multiple countries, and his passion for education and cultural exchange. He was nothing like the controlling patriarch I had feared meeting. When I mentioned my interrupted studies in international business, his eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Education is the greatest gift we can give ourselves," he said, leaning forward slightly. "What were your favorite subjects? What did you hope to do with your degree?" I found myself talking about my dreams of working in international development, helping bridge cultural gaps between different communities. As I spoke, I realized I hadn't talked about my aspirations with anyone in months. My family's financial crisis had forced me to set aside those dreams, but somehow this stranger was encouraging me to voice them again. "Those are admirable goals," Abdullah said thoughtfully. "Understanding between cultures is more important now than ever before. Have you considered that your current situation might actually provide unique opportunities to pursue those interests?" I looked at him skeptically. How could being sold into marriage possibly advance my career aspirations? But there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't being patronizing or dismissive. He seemed to be genuinely considering how my circumstances might be turned into advantages. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're finding this story as surprising as I was living it. The Sheikh's reaction to my dreams was just the beginning of revelations that would completely change my understanding of everything. After dinner, Abdullah suggested we take a walk in his private garden. The desert night was cool and clear, with more stars visible than I had ever seen in my life. The garden was an oasis of green in the middle of the sand, with flowing water features and carefully tended plants that somehow thrived in this harsh environment. "I want you to understand something important," Abdullah said, as we walked along a path lined with flowering shrubs. "I didn't ask Hassan to find me a wife. I asked him to find me a student, someone young and intelligent who could benefit from learning about international business while helping me see the world through fresh eyes." I stopped walking and stared at him. "But the papers I signed were legal documents ensuring your security and well-being while you live here," he finished. "Yes, There is a marriage certificate for legal purposes and your protection under local law. But I have no intention of demanding anything from you that you're not freely willing to give. My mind reeled as I tried to process this information. Everything I had assumed about my situation was apparently wrong. Then why did you pay my father so much money? Abdullah's expression grew serious. Because I know what it's like to watch a parent suffer and feel helpless to stop it. Your father wasn't selling you. He was desperately trying to save your mother's life. I simply provided a solution that could help your family while offering you opportunities you might not have had otherwise. We continued walking in silence as I struggled to understand this new perspective. The man I had expected to be my captor was presenting himself as something closer to a benefactor. But I had learned early in life that things too good to be true usually were exactly that. I don't understand, I finally said. What do you get out of this arrangement? You're not a charity and you don't even know me. Abdullah stopped beside a fountain where water danced in patterns illuminated by hidden lights. I get the company of someone intelligent and curious who can help me see my business ventures from a different perspective. I get conversation with someone who hasn't been influenced by years of corporate politics and traditional thinking. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've been successful in business for over 50 years, but success can become a prison if you're not careful. Everyone around me tells me what they think I want to hear. You, however, have no reason to flatter me or pretend to agree with everything I say. But surely you could have hired a business consultant or advisor for much less money and complication, I pointed out. Consultants come and go, Abdullah replied with a slight smile. They provide reports and recommendations, then disappear back to their other clients. What I'm offering you is something different, a true partnership where we both learn from each other. You'll gain real-world business experience that no university could provide, and I'll benefit from your fresh perspective and honest opinions. As we headed back toward the house, I felt more confused than ever. My captor was offering to be my mentor. My forced marriage was apparently meant to be an educational opportunity. Either this man was the most sophisticated manipulator I had ever encountered, or I had completely misunderstood the situation I had walked into. The next morning, I woke up in the most comfortable bed I had ever slept in, surrounded by luxury that still felt surreal. Amira brought breakfast and informed me that Abdullah would like to show me his office complex, but only if I was interested in learning about his various business operations. What if I said no? I asked, testing the boundaries of my supposed freedom. Amira smiled. Then I would tell him you preferred to spend the day reading in the library or exploring the gardens. Your time is your own here, unless you choose to spend it learning alongside him. This was definitely not the captivity I had expected. The next morning, I decided to test Abdullah's claims about my freedom by accepting his invitation to see his business operations. If this was truly about education and partnership rather than control, I wanted to understand exactly what I had walked into. Amira led me through corridors I hadn't seen before, toward what she called the business wing of the compound. What I discovered defied every expectation I had formed about wealthy Middle Eastern businessmen. Instead of a single impressive office, Abdullah had created what could only be described as a private university campus. There were multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, each dedicated to different aspects of his business empire. The first building housed his renewable energy division, where engineers and scientists worked on solar panel innovations and wind farm technologies. The second focused on educational initiatives, with teams developing programs to bring literacy and technical training to remote communities across Africa and Asia. The third building amazed me most of all. It was dedicated entirely to microfinance programs that helped women start small businesses in developing countries. This is incredible, I breathed as Abdullah showed me through state-of-the-art laboratories where researchers worked on making solar technology more affordable for rural communities. You're not just running businesses, you're trying to solve global problems. Abdullah smiled at my amazement. Profit without purpose is just greed with better accounting, he said. Every successful business should leave the world slightly better than it found it. But let me show you where your perspective could be invaluable. He led me to a conference room where his team was discussing expansion into South American markets. Maps, charts, and demographic studies covered every wall, but as I listened to their presentation, I noticed something crucial they were missing. Excuse me, I interrupted, surprising myself with my boldness. But have you considered how the cultural attitudes toward women entrepreneurs might affect your microfinance programs in these regions? The room fell silent. 20-something executives and analysts stared at the 19-year-old girl who had just questioned their research. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Abdullah gestured for me to continue. In many Latin American communities, women handle household finances, but may need their husband's permission for formal business loans, I explained, drawing on knowledge from my international studies. Your program structure might need to include cultural sensitivity training and family education components to be truly effective. The lead analyst, a sharp-looking woman in her 30s named Sarah, pulled up additional data on her tablet. "She's absolutely right," Sarah said after reviewing the information. "Our preliminary research focused on economic factors but didn't adequately address cultural barriers. This could save us from making expensive mistakes." Abdullah's eyes twinkled with something that looked suspiciously like pride. "This is exactly why fresh perspectives are so valuable," he told the room. "Experience teaches us what has worked before, but innovation requires us to see what we've been missing." After the meeting, Sarah approached me with genuine curiosity. "Where did you study international development?" she asked. When I explained my interrupted education, her expression shifted to respect. "You have excellent instincts. Have you considered that real-world experience might be more valuable than classroom theory?" That afternoon, Abdullah suggested I spend time with different department heads to understand how each division operated. "Think of it as a personalized MBA program," he said, "but instead of case studies, you'll work on actual projects that affect real people's lives." I spent the rest of the week rotating through departments, and each day brought new revelations about the scope of Abdullah's operations. His renewable energy projects were providing electricity to rural villages that had never had power before. His educational programs had built over 200 schools in areas where children previously had no access to learning. His microfinance initiatives had helped more than 50,000 women start their own businesses. But what impressed me most was how he treated his employees. This wasn't a typical corporate hierarchy where the CEO remained isolated in an executive suite. Abdullah knew the names of janitors and security guards. He asked about their families, remembered their children's birthdays, and had created a profit-sharing program that made even entry-level employees feel invested in the company's success. "How do you manage to keep track of so many people?" I asked during one of our evening walks in the garden. "People aren't spreadsheets or profit margins," Abdullah replied. "They're the most important investment any business can make. When employees feel valued and respected, they contribute ideas and innovations that no amount of money can buy." I was beginning to understand that my preconceptions about wealthy businessmen had been shaped by limited exposure and media stereotypes. Abdullah wasn't a heartless capitalist. He was a social entrepreneur who happened to be extraordinarily successful at creating sustainable change. By the end of my first week, I was genuinely excited about the projects I was learning about. When Abdullah asked if I'd like to try developing a presentation about cultural considerations for the South American expansion, I surprised myself by saying yes immediately. Working on my first real business presentation felt like stepping into a world I had only dreamed about during my university studies. Abdullah provided me with access to research databases, cultural analysts, and economic reports that would have cost thousands of dollars for a student to access. But more valuable than the resources was his mentoring approach. Instead of telling me what to include in the presentation, he asked questions that guided me toward discovering insights on my own. "What factors do you think might make a woman in rural Peru hesitant to start a business?" he would ask. "How might family dynamics in conservative communities affect loan repayment rates?" These conversations often extended long into the evening, as we sat in his study surrounded by books in multiple languages and artifacts from his travels around the world. I learned that Abdullah spoke 7 languages fluently and had lived in different countries for years at a time, not as a tourist, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding diverse cultures. "The biggest mistake wealthy people make," he told me one evening as we reviewed demographic data, "is assuming that people in other circumstances think the way they do. Poverty isn't just about lack of money. It's about lack of choices, lack of safety nets, and often lack of hope." I found myself sharing stories about my own family's struggles, how the fear of medical bankruptcy had affected every decision we made for months. Abdullah listened without judgment, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that helped me see how my personal experiences could inform broader policy decisions. "Your perspective is exactly what our expansion team needs," he said, after I finished explaining how my mother's illness had forced our family to choose between buying medicine and paying rent. "You understand the human cost of economic theory in ways that spreadsheets can never capture." My presentation day arrived faster than I expected. The conference room filled with department heads, analysts, and via video conference, potential partners from 3 different South American countries. I had never presented to an audience of successful professionals before, and my hands shook as I connected my laptop to the projection system. But as I began speaking about cultural barriers to women's entrepreneurship, something amazing happened. The nervousness faded, replaced by genuine passion for the subject matter. I wasn't just reciting research, I was sharing insights that could genuinely help improve people's lives. The presentation included recommendations for family education programs, partnerships with local women's organizations, and graduated loan structures that accounted for seasonal income variations in agricultural communities. I had spent 2 weeks researching every detail, and the depth of preparation showed. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then Sarah started asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, budget considerations, and potential partnership organizations. The video conference participants jumped in with questions about how my recommendations might apply to their specific regions. If you're enjoying this journey as much as I am, please give this video a thumbs up. What started as the worst day of my life was turning into something I never could have imagined, and we're just getting started. The discussion that followed my presentation lasted for over an hour. Ideas bounced around the room as experienced professionals built upon my foundational research with their own expertise and contacts. I watched in amazement as concepts I had developed were refined and expanded into what could become a comprehensive program affecting thousands of lives. "This is excellent work," said Miguel, the video participant from Colombia. "The cultural sensitivity components address concerns that have caused problems for international development programs in our region for decades. When can we schedule follow-up meetings to discuss implementation?" Abdullah, who had remained quietly observant throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "I think we should ask our newest team member what she believes the next steps should be," he said, gesturing toward me. The words team member hit me like a lightning bolt. Somewhere during the past 2 weeks, I had stopped being a purchased wife and had become a valued contributor to meaningful work. The transformation had happened so gradually that I hadn't noticed until Abdullah named it explicitly. That evening, as we celebrated the successful presentation with dinner in the garden, I finally asked the question that had been building in my mind. "Why are you really doing this? Not the business projects, I understand those, but why are you investing so much time and energy in educating me?" Abdullah was quiet for a long moment, watching the fountain in the center of the garden. "Have you ever noticed that the most successful mentors often have no biological children to inherit their knowledge?" he finally said. I realized I had never considered Abdullah's family situation. In all our conversations about business and culture, personal family details had never come up. "My wife died young before we could have children," he continued. "I've spent 50 years building businesses and accumulating knowledge, but knowledge that isn't shared dies with the person who holds it. You represent something I never had, the opportunity to pass on everything I've learned to someone who might use it to make the world better." The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket. This wasn't just about business mentoring, it was about legacy, about ensuring that decades of wisdom and experience wouldn't disappear when he was gone. Understanding Abdullah's deeper motivations changed something fundamental in our relationship. What had begun as an arrangement between a desperate father and a wealthy benefactor was evolving into genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. But as I settled more comfortably into my new role, I began to notice subtle tensions within the organization that hadn't been apparent during my first weeks. It started with small things, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms, email threads that I wasn't included in despite being relevant to projects I was working on, polite smiles that didn't reach people's eyes when they interacted with me. At first, I assumed it was natural workplace politics. I was young, inexperienced, and had arrived under unusual circumstances. Of course, some employees would be skeptical about my qualifications and wondering whether I was just Abdullah's latest whim. But the pattern of exclusion became more pronounced after my successful presentation. Instead of gaining acceptance, I seemed to have triggered resentment among certain staff members. Sarah, who had been supportive during my first week, became noticeably cooler in our interactions. "Is everything all right?" I asked her after a particularly tense planning meeting where my suggestions had been politely dismissed without discussion. "Of course," Sarah replied with a smile that felt forced. "We're all just adjusting to the new dynamic. Change can be challenging in established organizations." Her words were professionally appropriate, but something in her tone suggested deeper concerns. I began paying closer attention to office dynamics and gradually realized that my rapid integration into high-level decision-making was creating ripples of discontent among people who had worked years to reach similar positions. The situation came to a head during a meeting about the educational initiative budget. I had prepared detailed cost analyses for 3 different expansion scenarios, including creative financing options that could stretch the budget further. When I presented my research, the response was noticeably lukewarm. "These are interesting ideas," said David, the Education Division Director, "but they don't account for the complexity of real-world implementation. Perhaps we should stick with more traditional approaches that have proven track records." I felt my cheeks flush with frustration. My recommendations were based on extensive research and consultations with field experts, not naive idealism. But before I could respond, Abdullah intervened in a way that surprised everyone in the room. "David, I'm curious about your specific concerns with the implementation complexity," Abdullah said calmly. "Could you elaborate on which aspects you think might be problematic?" As David struggled to provide detailed objections to proposals he had apparently dismissed without thorough consideration, the real issue became clear. The resistance wasn't about the quality of my work. It was about the threat my rapid advancement represented to established hierarchies. After the meeting, Abdullah asked me to join him for a private conversation in his study. "How are you feeling about the workplace dynamics?" he asked directly. I had been trying to handle the situation diplomatically, but his direct question opened floodgates of frustration. "I feel like I'm being judged by different standards," I admitted. "My ideas are automatically suspect because of how I arrived here, and some people seem to think I'm getting opportunities I haven't earned." Abdullah nodded thoughtfully. "You're experiencing something that every successful woman in business faces, but amplified by the unusual circumstances of your position here. The question is, how do you want to handle it?" "I want to prove that I belong here," I said immediately. "I want my work to speak for itself." "That's admirable," Abdullah replied. "But proving yourself to people who are determined to discredit you is often a losing battle. Sometimes the better strategy is to find ways to make potential opponents into allies." Over the following days, I began implementing Abdullah's advice by approaching the situation differently. Instead of trying to prove my worth through individual achievements, I started looking for ways to make my colleagues successful. When Sarah mentioned struggling with cultural research for a project in Southeast Asia, I offered to share resources and contacts that might help her. When David's education team faced budget constraints that threatened a school construction project, I worked overtime to develop alternative funding proposals that could save the initiative. Rather than presenting these as my own ideas, I framed them as collaborative solutions that built on the team's existing expertise. The shift in approach began yielding results within weeks. People who had been suspicious of my motives started seeing me as someone who contributed to their success rather than competing for their positions. The collaborative dynamic that emerged was far more productive than the defensive environment that had been developing. But just as workplace relationships were improving, I faced an entirely different kind of challenge that would test everything I had learned about resilience and problem solving. The call came at 3 in the morning, jolting me awake with the harsh ring of international communication. Amira knocked softly on my door, her face grave in the hallway lighting. "It's your father," she said gently. "There's been an emergency." My hands trembled as I took the phone, preparing myself for the worst news about my mother's condition. But the crisis was something I hadn't anticipated. "The authorities came today." My father's voice was barely a whisper. "They're saying the money wasn't legally obtained. They've frozen all our accounts and stopped your mother's treatments." The room spun as I tried to process what he was telling me. Someone had reported that our family's sudden financial improvement was suspicious, triggering an investigation into the source of the funds. Without access to the money for medical bills, my mother's cancer treatments had been suspended immediately. "How long can she survive without the chemotherapy?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "The doctors say maybe 2 weeks, my father replied, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. I don't know who to call. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed, feeling like the world was collapsing around me. Everything I had sacrificed, everything my family had endured, was being undone by bureaucratic suspicion and legal complications I didn't understand. Abdullah found me in the garden an hour later, sitting by the fountain where we had shared so many evening conversations. I hadn't realized I was crying until he handed me a handkerchief and sat beside me on the stone bench. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. Through tears and broken sentences, I explained the situation. Abdullah listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as he understood the implications. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering options I couldn't see. "This is not uncommon when large amounts of money cross international borders," he finally said. "Governments are rightfully suspicious of transactions that could be related to money laundering or other illegal activities, but there are ways to resolve this situation." "How?" I asked desperately. "My mother doesn't have weeks to wait for legal processes." "Legal documentation and proper channels," Abdullah replied. "The money was legitimately earned and legally transferred. What we need to do is provide authorities with sufficient documentation to verify the source and legitimacy of the funds." Over the next 24 hours, I watched Abdullah transform from mentor to powerful advocate. He contacted lawyers in multiple countries, arranged for embassy officials to expedite document processing, and personally called government officials to explain the humanitarian nature of the financial transfer. But even with his influence and resources, the legal process was complex and time-sensitive. Each day that passed brought my mother closer to a point where delayed treatment might be too late to save her life. The stress was overwhelming, and I found myself questioning whether any of the opportunities I had gained were worth the risk to my mother's survival. "I should go home," I told Abdullah during one particularly dark moment. "Maybe if I'm there to explain the situation directly, they'll release the funds faster." "That's not going to help," Abdullah said firmly. "If you leave now under these circumstances, it will only raise more suspicions about the legitimacy of our arrangement. The best thing you can do for your mother is to trust the legal process and let the proper authorities handle this situation." His words made sense logically, but emotionally I felt helpless being so far away while my family faced this crisis. The guilt was overwhelming. Had my decision to come here somehow made things worse for the people I was trying to help? It was Sarah who provided the perspective I needed to regain my emotional balance. Despite our earlier workplace tensions, she had become a genuine supporter since I had started focusing on collaborative success. She found me in the library where I was frantically researching international financial law, trying to find some solution I could implement myself. "You know," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from me, "I've been thinking about the skills you've developed since arriving here, problem-solving under pressure, navigating complex international systems, advocating for people who can't advocate for themselves. These aren't just business skills. They're exactly what your family needs right now." Her words helped me realize that my time with Abdullah hadn't just been about personal development. It had been preparation for handling exactly this kind of crisis with clarity and strategic thinking rather than panic and desperation. That evening, instead of wallowing in guilt and helplessness, I approached the situation like a business problem that needed systematic solutions. I created detailed timelines of required documentation, identified potential bottlenecks in the approval process, and developed contingency plans for different scenarios. The legal breakthrough came on the fourth day, when Abdullah's embassy contacts confirmed that all required documentation had been submitted and verified. The funds would be released within 48 hours, and my mother's treatments could resume immediately. As I called my father with the good news, I realized something profound had shifted in my understanding of my situation. I wasn't just a victim of circumstances beyond my control, nor was I simply a beneficiary of Abdullah's generosity. I had become someone capable of navigating complex challenges and finding solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The crisis had tested everything I had learned about resilience, strategic thinking, and the importance of building strong support networks. Most importantly, it had shown me that the partnership Abdullah had offered wasn't just about business education, it was about developing the skills and confidence to handle any challenge life might present. But even as this immediate crisis was resolving, I sensed that our story was building toward an even more significant turning point that would define not just my future, but the legacy Abdullah hoped to create through our unlikely partnership. 6 months after that terrifying phone call about my mother's frozen medical funds, I received news that would change everything I thought I knew about my future. Abdullah called me into his study on a Tuesday evening, but something felt different about his demeanor. Instead of our usual casual conversation, he seemed formal, almost ceremonial in his approach. "I have something important to discuss with you," he began, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk rather than our usual comfortable arrangement on the sofas. "My doctors have given me some information that affects our long-term plans." My heart stopped. In the months we had worked together, Abdullah had become far more than a mentor or business partner. He had become the father figure I had never really had, the person who believed in my potential when I couldn't see it myself. The thought of losing him felt like facing another devastating crisis. "How serious is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Serious enough that we need to make some important decisions about the future," Abdullah replied carefully. "I have perhaps 18 months, maybe 2 years, if the treatments are successful. But more importantly, I have work that needs to continue long after I'm gone." The room felt like it was spinning as I tried to process what he was telling me. Abdullah wasn't just my mentor. He was the driving force behind businesses that employed thousands of people and programs that were literally saving lives around the world. What would happen to all of that when he was gone? "I've been thinking about this for some time," Abdullah continued, "even before the medical diagnosis. Building a business empire is meaningless if it dies with the person who created it. What matters is creating something sustainable that will continue growing and helping people for generations." He stood up and walked to a wall safe I had never noticed before, hidden behind a painting of traditional Arabic calligraphy. From it, he withdrew a thick folder of legal documents that he placed on the desk between us. "These are ownership transfer papers," he said simply. "Legal documentation that would make you the majority owner of all my business operations, with full authority to continue the work we've been doing together." I stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language I couldn't comprehend. "I don't understand. You're talking about billions of dollars in assets. Why would you give that to someone you've known for less than a year?" Abdullah smiled with the same patient expression he had worn during our first dinner together. "Because in less than a year, you've proven something that most people never demonstrate in entire careers. You've shown that you can think beyond your own immediate interests and make decisions that benefit others, even when those decisions require personal sacrifice." He was referring to incidents over the past few months where I had consistently chosen long-term sustainability over short-term profits in business recommendations. When faced with opportunities to cut costs by reducing employee benefits, I had instead developed proposals to increase productivity through improved working conditions. When investors suggested expanding into markets that would generate quick returns but potentially harm local communities, I had advocated for more ethical alternatives that would take longer to develop but create lasting positive impact. "But I'm still learning," I protested. "I make mistakes. I don't have enough experience. I don't even have a college degree." "Experience without wisdom is just accumulated mistakes," Abdullah replied. "Wisdom without experience is just theoretical knowledge. You have demonstrated wisdom that can't be taught in universities, the understanding that true success comes from lifting others up rather than climbing over them." The weight of what he was proposing began to sink in. This wasn't just about inheriting a business. It was about taking responsibility for the livelihoods of thousands of employees and the welfare of millions of people who benefited from the company's social programs. "What if I fail?" I asked, voicing the fear that was paralyzing my ability to think clearly. "Then you'll learn from the failure and do better next time," Abdullah said matter-of-factly. "But failure is only devastating when you're working for selfish goals. When you're working to help others, even failures become stepping stones toward eventually succeeding." Over the following weeks, Abdullah began what he called succession training, intensive preparation for taking over responsibilities I had never imagined handling. This wasn't just about understanding financial statements and operational procedures. It was about developing the leadership skills needed to inspire and guide an organization through inevitable challenges and changes. The most difficult part wasn't learning the technical aspects of running a multinational corporation. It was overcoming the psychological barrier of believing I deserved such enormous responsibility and trust. Every day, I fought against the voice in my head that insisted I was just a 19-year-old girl from rural Morocco who had been lucky enough to catch a wealthy man's attention. But Abdullah had anticipated this struggle. "Do you know why I never had biological children?" he asked during one of our evening planning sessions. I had wondered about this but had never felt comfortable asking directly, because I learned early in life that the most important relationships aren't determined by genetics, he continued. The people who truly matter are those who choose to care about the same things you care about. You've chosen to care about using business as a force for positive change in the world. That makes you more my true heir than any biological child who might have inherited my money but not my values. As the succession training progressed, I began to understand that Abdullah had been preparing me for this responsibility from the moment I arrived. Every project I had worked on, every challenge I had faced, every skill I had developed had been part of a comprehensive education designed to prepare me for exactly this moment. The South American expansion project that had started with my first presentation was now being implemented with the cultural sensitivity protocols I had recommended. The employee profit-sharing programs I had helped design were being adopted across all divisions. The crisis management skills I had developed during my mother's medical emergency were being applied to help other employees facing family challenges. But the true test of my readiness came when Abdullah suffered a minor heart attack that required emergency hospitalization. For 3 days, I found myself making decisions that affected thousands of people while he recovered. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously, proof that the training had prepared me for real-world leadership responsibilities. When Abdullah returned to work a week later, he found that the business had not only continued operating smoothly, but had actually improved efficiency in several departments where I had implemented new communication protocols during the crisis. "Now I know you're ready," he said with quiet satisfaction. The formal transfer of ownership took place on a crisp December morning, exactly 11 months after I had first arrived at the compound as a frightened teenager who believed her life had been sold for medical bills. The ceremony was held in the main conference room, with lawyers, government officials, and key employees gathered to witness the legal documentation that would change my life forever. As I signed each document, I thought about the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. The girl who had arrived here expecting to become a silent, subservient wife was now becoming the CEO of a business empire dedicated to making the world better for people who had been forgotten by traditional economic systems. But the most emotional moment came when Abdullah presented me with a letter he had written months earlier, to be opened only after the ownership transfer was complete. With shaking hands, I broke the seal and read his words. "To my daughter, in all ways that matter, you came to me as someone seeking survival, but you leave as someone capable of helping others thrive. The money your father received was never payment for purchasing you. It was an investment in the future leader I believed you could become. Your family's medical crisis gave us the opportunity to meet, but your character and wisdom earned you everything that follows." The letter continued with detailed explanations of trust funds he had established, not just for me but for my parents, ensuring that my mother would have access to the best medical care for the rest of her life, and my father would never again face the desperation that had led to our original arrangement. "But most importantly," the letter concluded, "remember that this inheritance comes with the responsibility to continue growing, learning, and helping others discover their own potential. The businesses you now own are not possessions to be hoarded, but tools to be used for creating opportunities for people who have been overlooked by others." Reading these words in front of a room full of witnesses, I finally understood the full scope of what Abdullah had done. This hadn't been a marriage arrangement, or even a mentorship in the traditional sense. It had been an elaborate, year-long evaluation to determine whether I possessed the character needed to carry forward his life's work. The transition period that followed was both challenging and incredibly rewarding. Abdullah remained as chairman emeritus, providing guidance and advice, but the day-to-day decisions were now my responsibility. The first major test came when we received a takeover offer from a multinational corporation that would have doubled the value of our holdings overnight. "It's an incredible offer," Sarah told me during the board meeting where we discussed the proposal. "You could walk away with more money than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes. But as I reviewed the acquiring company's track record, I discovered they had a history of purchasing socially responsible businesses and then dismantling the programs that made them special, focusing purely on profit maximization. Accepting their offer would mean abandoning thousands of employees and millions of beneficiaries who depended on our programs. "We're not selling," I announced to the board, surprising several members who had assumed I would be tempted by the enormous financial gain. Our purpose isn't to maximize shareholder value, it's to maximize human value. This company will continue operating according to the principles that made it successful. The decision to reject the takeover offer proved to be a turning point in how employees and partners viewed my leadership. It demonstrated that I was committed to the company's mission rather than personal enrichment, establishing credibility that no amount of training could have provided. Over the following months, I implemented several innovations that expanded our impact while maintaining profitability. We launched a program that provided microfinance and business training to young women in situations similar to mine, helping them avoid the desperation that could lead to exploitation. We partnered with universities to create internship programs that gave students from disadvantaged backgrounds access to real-world business experience. Most meaningfully, we established the Abdullah Al-Rashid Foundation for Cultural Bridge Building, which provided scholarships and exchange programs for young people to learn about different cultures and business practices. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was a teenage girl from rural Bangladesh whose family had been considering an arranged marriage to solve their financial problems. But perhaps the most important innovation was the establishment of a mentorship network that connected successful business leaders with young people who showed potential but lacked opportunities. The program was based on the model Abdullah had used with me, identifying individuals with character and wisdom, then providing them with resources and guidance to develop their leadership abilities. As the company continued to grow and expand its positive impact, I began to understand that Abdullah's greatest gift hadn't been the business empire itself. It had been the lesson that true wealth comes from using your resources and abilities to create opportunities for others. The scared teenager who had arrived believing her life was over had discovered that it was actually just beginning. Every challenge I had faced, every skill I had developed, every relationship I had built, had been preparation for a purpose larger than anything I could have imagined. Abdullah's health continued to decline gradually, but he lived to see the business expand into 12 new countries and help over 200,000 people start their own enterprises. More importantly, he lived to see me become not just a successful business leader, but someone committed to identifying and developing the next generation of leaders who would continue this work long after both of us were gone. 2 years after taking control of the business, I stood in the same garden where Abdullah and I had shared so many evening conversations, but this time I was alone. He had passed away peacefully the week before, surrounded by the chosen family of employees and protégés who had become the legacy he had always dreamed of creating. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by his vision and generosity. Former scholarship recipients who were now running their own businesses, employees who had been promoted from entry-level positions to department heads, and community leaders from dozens of countries where our programs had made a difference. But as I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been in my external circumstances. It had been in my understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life. The girl who had believed she was being sold into servitude had discovered that she was actually being recruited for a mission. The teenager who had thought her dreams were ending had learned that they were just expanding beyond anything she could have previously imagined. The young woman who had felt powerless and voiceless had developed into someone capable of speaking for millions of people who needed advocates and opportunities. My mother's health had stabilized with access to the best medical care money could provide. My father had started a small consulting business, helping other families navigate international financial systems. They visited regularly, no longer seeing me as the daughter who had been sacrificed for family survival, but as the woman who had transformed a crisis into an opportunity for everyone involved. The business continued to thrive under my leadership, but more importantly, it continued to evolve and adapt to meet changing global needs. We had launched initiatives addressing climate change, educational inequality, and economic empowerment in over 30 countries. The profit-sharing programs had made hundreds of employees financially independent, and many had left to start their own socially responsible businesses. But the achievement I was most proud of was the mentorship network that had grown to include over 50 successful leaders, who were each developing the next generation of change-makers. We had created a self-sustaining system for identifying and nurturing people who had the character and vision needed to solve the world's most pressing problems. Standing in that garden where my transformation had begun, I thought about how dramatically my understanding of success had changed. I had arrived believing that survival was the highest goal anyone could achieve. I was leaving with the knowledge that significance, the impact you have on other people's lives, is what ultimately determines whether your time on Earth has been worthwhile. The compound that had initially felt like a prison had become a launching pad for adventures and opportunities I never could have dreamed of. The man I had feared would control my destiny had instead taught me how to take control of it myself. The arrangement that had seemed like the end of my freedom had actually been the beginning of my ability to help others find their own. As I prepared to board the plane for my next destination, a conference in Kenya, where I would be speaking about sustainable business practices, I carried with me the letter Abdullah had written for me to open on the second anniversary of taking over the business. "My dearest daughter," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the investment I made in your potential has paid dividends beyond anything I could have hoped for. You have proven that the most powerful force for change in the world isn't money or technology. It's the human capacity to care about something larger than yourself." The letter went on to reveal one final surprise. Abdullah had established a trust fund that would provide me with a comfortable income for life, but only on the condition that I never owned more than 20% of any business I was involved with. The remaining 80% had to be distributed among employees, community partners, and social programs. "True wealth," he had written, "comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you circulate. The moment you start hoarding resources, instead of using them to create opportunities for others, you stop being a leader and become just another wealthy person." As the plane lifted off from Dubai, I looked down at the city that had become my second home and thought about all the young women around the world who were facing the same kind of desperate circumstances that had brought me here. Through our scholarship programs, mentorship networks, and business initiatives, we were creating alternatives to exploitation and hopelessness. The scared 19-year-old who had believed her life was being sold had discovered that it was actually being invested. The investment had paid returns beyond anything measured in money. It had created a network of people committed to ensuring that no one would have to choose between dignity and survival. Abdullah had been right about everything. The most important inheritance isn't money or property. It's wisdom, values, and the commitment to pass those gifts on to the next generation. The girl who had arrived as a victim had left as a victor, not over other people, but over the circumstances that try to convince us we're powerless to change the world. My story had begun with what seemed like the worst possible ending, but as I flew toward new challenges and opportunities, I understood that every ending is actually just a new beginning in disguise. The key is having the courage to look for the possibilities hidden within the problems. The truth that changed everything wasn't just about Abdullah's kindness or the opportunities he provided. It was the discovery that we all have far more power than we realize to transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. Sometimes it just takes the right person believing in us before we can believe in ourselves. And sometimes the person who seems to be buying your future is actually investing in it.